I'd like to welcome you all VCS 24. This class, we have Scott Hansen giving an instruction on pixel controllers and how to integrate with xLIghts. So, Scott, I am turning it over to you. Please begin.
Well, thank you very much. I have a QR code here. This is actually a link to the presentation, so if you want to follow along, or if you go to my website, I have on the bottom, scottnation.com, there's a tab called presentations, and there's one called 2024 controllers. So if you're interested in information and looking it up later, I kind of got that all. So who am I? I'm Scott Hansen. I live Grand Rapids, Michigan, technically Wyoming. It's a suburb of Grand Rapids. If you got your handy map of Michigan, it's the west coast of Michigan, away from Detroit and Flint and all those awesome cities. Um, I've basically put an animated Christmas lights on my house since about 2017. I've been contributing slash developing to xLIghts since about September of 2017. I like to say I'm the lead manual writer. I'm pretty much the only active manual writer. My day job, I'm an electrical engineer at an automotive company in Michigan. I also do software development, so like PLC type stuff. There's a picture of me and my 19-month-old son here in front of our house in Michigan. So when we want to look at controllers in your Christmas light display, there's kind of an overview of things you need to think about. What is most important when we're picking a controller is your show layout. And you always want to think about the future. If you're buying just a 16 port controller because you only have like 16 ports you need this year, maybe you need to start thinking about next year. And when you do your design, maybe instead of having one controller in the middle of your layout, have multiple across your house. So maybe this year we're only using 8 ports, but next year we'll have more stuff, so we'll need 16. So when you're kind of thinking about what controller is best for you, think about that. There's what I call modes of operation. So if you're getting different types of pixel controllers, are you going to run them in like bridge mode, master remote? Are you going to use FBP, X schedule? And some of them, we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about differential versus local ports and how you can do more. There's also your technical ability. Sometimes you don't want to insult anyone, but I am a software developer, so I'm a less afraid of some more advanced controllers. If you're really new into the hobby, maybe a Culp controller is kind of complicated for you. Maybe a simpler controller would be easier for you to understand if computers are kind of scary to you. It's also, are you going to build your whole controller enclosure, or are you going to go just buy one from like CCL controllers? That kind of limits which controllers you can get because only certain vendors sell certain ready-to-made ones. And the biggest thing is also your budget. So do you have a large budget that you can get, advanced controllers, or are you trying to do it cheap and do like WLED type controllers? So we'll first talk about pixel controllers. If you do go through these slides later, I do have a lot of stuff about AC controllers. Just kind of at the end, I basically just have a repository of different controller types and features. I'm not going to go through there and bore you with controller, PowerPoint to death. But if you want to come back to this, that's why I put the QR code. You can always kind of look, and it just has my information about what I know about controllers and their capabilities. So the most basic thing on most controllers we have are what I call local pixel outputs. You'll normally see them as green connectors, or the classic. On most older controllers, now some newer ones are using different style connectors. But these ports are intended for driving lights locally off the controller. Most controllers have 4, 8, 16. They are normally fused. Older ones use automotive style fuses. Now newer ones use E-fuses, which are basically like digital fuses that auto reset. The one downside of local ports is in here I put 30 to 40 feet as the max distance you can have the prop from the controller. In reality, I've done up to like 60 and sometimes 90 feet, but I wouldn't say that's like an exception to the rule. I would try to design for 30 to 40 feet. And most controllers support 5 or 12 volt pixels. Older ones will have a selector switch. Newer ones now, they just automatically switch between because they have their power supply just auto switches. And some of the newer ones also support 24 volts. So if you're using 24 volt pixels, which are kind of common with puck lights and some of the new string lights, Some of them support that as well. You kind of have to watch it. You have to look at the exact controller because some don't support 24, and 24 is a little bit harder with the E fuses. You have to get different. There's special E fuses for those. So a real basic diagram, you have your controller, you have your lights, and you just plug them straight into the ports. And that's what I'm saying, like 20 to 40, I have 20 to 50 on here, is kind of like the max distance you can be from the controllers. It is a little bit dependent on what are the resistor packs in the controller, which is a little advanced, but most newer ones now use better resistor pack values, so you should be able to get those larger distances. The second main type of controller outputs is what we call long range or differential outputs. There are some controllers that are just all differential outputs, and these are kind of initially were very popular with large shows like drive-throughs, where you'd have a central controller and then you kind of spider out all the props around your yard. How that normally works is you have these ports, and they're RJ45 ports, but they're not Ethernet. Each one of these ports would go to a receiver, which you'll see on the right here, that would be locally by the prop with only 4 ports, and then you run an Ethernet cable back to the main controller. That Ethernet cable can be, I say 300 feet in here. In theory, you can almost go up to 500 to 1,000 feet, but that's kind of pushing it. Most people installations are anywhere from 300 is kind of the max. The one downside is they only support 3-wire pixels, which isn't a huge downside nowadays because I doubt anyone really runs 4-wire pixels anymore. Those are kind of older technologies. But the cost can also be a little bit more because now you have to have these differential boards at all the props as well. So it does require differentials at the props. Some of the smart receiver controllers do have a couple local ports, like the V4 does, Falcons. So you can run 4 local props if needed, like if you have just a couple nearby. But like the Culp ones, it's all differential based. So kind of the basic diagram, you have your differential controller, you would have this Ethernet cable, be this 300 foot to the remote board, which would have its own power supply. And that's another advantage, is these can have separate power supplies. So you could do 5-volt pixels on one, 12 on another, and kind of do more distributed if you needed. And then that's what would drive your local pixels. So some controllers kind of mix and match these. You'll see like the Culps and Falcons, they have some remote ports and they have some local ports. Like this is a K8, or it's actually an older F8. But it can do 12 ports of remote and it has 8 local. You'll see like this is a new Falcon V4. It has 4 local ports, which do mirror one of the remote ports. So it's not additional ports, but it does have some local, and then the rest are remote. And then like this older SAN device, it's all local. There is no like differential type concept. So a lot of controllers also have DMX/serial output. So this is for doing things like moving heads. If you need to run lower controllers, or if you have older Renard controllers, that's what I personally use it for, or anything DMX. So if you're using like floods, moving heads, fog machines, anything like that. Most controllers do still have 1 port. Some of the older ones had 2 or more. This is becoming kind of less used, but there's still normally 1. So like on the Falcon, the last one there, the RJ45 connector, there's little jumpers, so you can set it to lower or DMX mode. That's your DMX port. The Hinks Pix here, it just has 1 that you'd wire it up. This is an older K32. It has 2 right here that you'd wire it up. The newer ones, the K16s, they actually have a RJ45 similar to the Falcons now. So in xLIghts, that's just another output you can configure to do more things. Another thing that some of the newer controllers don't have this concept as much anymore is I call expandability. So the V4, the Falcon V4, the Falcon V3, like the K16, the K8, they all have an expansion port where you can hook up more outputs. And you can kind of select what type you want. So if, like on an F16, if you want to do all differentials, you can add a differential board. So you can do more differential ports, or you can add a local one and do more local ports. So like the F16 V4, it supports 48 total ports. So you can actually put 2 of these expansion boards. Like a K16, you can add 1 expansion board and add another 16 remote or local ports. The Hinks picks, they also have a similar one. Their V2 controller has 3 ports total, so you can do 48, and then their V3 controller has 5 ports, so you can actually do 80 outputs on them. The thing to keep in mind with the expansion boards is the V3 used a 40-pin connector, and the V4 uses a 24-pin connector. So if you have older culps, some of those use the 40-pin connector, but I know starting last year, the culps switched to the 24-pin connector. So when you get expansion boards, you have to make sure you order the right one. There aren't really adapter cables out there. It is possible to make them. I've made them manually, but they're not normally commercially available. The Hinks Picks one, which is this little one, and this middle one, they also use a 24 port, but it's not compatible with the F16 V4's 24s, so you can't really use them together. I would not plug them in because it'll probably blow them up. But so you just got to kind of make sure if you're ordering parts for older controllers, the newer ones, you get the right one. I know the white ones are getting harder to find for the older controllers, so you got to make sure you get the right ones. Here's kind of a diagram of a couple boxes. One's mine, one's I've found, of how this expansion works. So on the left here, we have a F16 V3. It has the ribbon cable that then goes to a 16 port output. So now that controller has 32 outputs and you only still have 1 controller. This one also does have some power distribution boards down here for power injection. And on the right here, this is one of my controllers. Again, it has a 16 port local expansion on it with a ribbon cable. So you have your 16 local ports on the controller itself. Then I have another 8 wired up here on the top. So we have 24 ports off this. So you can run 24 outputs off this one box. I could wire the other 8 and have 32. And this board also has some remote ports if I wanted to do that as well. So a lot of the controllers have that capability of doing 32 or 48 outputs. It does mean you kind of need a bigger box and it gets more cramped, but you can do more outputs with most of them. So kind of as I was saying before, the Falcon V4, the newer culps like the 2023 use a 24 pin. Older V3 and the K8s pre-23 use a 40 pin. And then Hinks Picks, they have a 24 pin, but it's not compatible with the Falcons. So I kind of talked about, I call them modes of operations. There's kind of 3 primary ways that we can run a controller. The first, called bridge mode. So how that works, and most controllers support this, you would have your computer running xLIghts, xSchedule, or a Raspberry Pi. It would send data. That would be E131, DDP, ArtNet. It would just send out your pixel data to the controller. The controller would read the data, interpret it, and then just output it to the lights. This is kind of the most basic mode, the most simple. The controller is relatively dumb. It doesn't have to know. It knows about its channels, but it doesn't know about the sequences and playback and what songs you're playing. It's very much just I take data in, I put data out. This is most common. Pretty much, I think every controller support it, unless you're getting some specialty controllers like a F-prop or something like that. So you'll see some terms about different protocols for this quote-unquote bridge mode. The most common one, and it's an industry standard, E131. This is what's used. It's called streaming ACN net. It's basically an evolution of DMX in the theater space. If you've ever worked in theater space, they use DMX 512. It uses universes channels, and E131/ArtNet is kind of an Ethernet-based version of that protocol. It's pretty much an industry standard. Every controller will support E131. It's very common, because it needs to be. Most controllers need to support it for our hobby and for commercial type things if you're using it with commercial sound and light boards, things like that. A newer protocol called DDP. A lot of our controllers in our hobby support them, but this is not very common in like the theater industry or other industries. It is getting some popularity. And also because of that, a lot of older controllers don't support it. But if you buy a controller in the last 2 or so years, if you have a Falcon V4 or any of the newer ones, they all support it. It's become more popular because it's a lot more efficient than E131. Under the hood, basically DDP can be approximately 3 times as efficient as E131, so it'll be less packets over your network. So I kind of have a list of most of the common controllers here support it, but if you're using an older controller like an AlphaPix, SanDevice, the SanDevice does have a newer firmware that supposedly supports it, but I personally have not been able to get it to work. So, but if you're using like a Falcon V4, a Genius, I would use it. The HinksPix also supports it, but because of some limitations in the HinksPix, I would not recommend using it. I would still go with E131. But if you're using a Culp or an FPP, they're widely supported and it's very well used. So if you're using those, I would use it. So a newer thing that a lot of newer controllers also support is, I'll call it standalone mode. So controllers will have an SD card port on them where you can load your sequences, put that in your SD slot, and then you can just play on the controller. And this is intended for like local playback if you wanted to put a controller, I don't know, on like a boat or in your car, just independently by itself, or if you just had a very small show, like you only have a mega tree in your yard and you just want to play, very basic sequences, it'll just play locally on the controller. You don't normally need internet because most of them do have what are called real-time clocks, which will keep the time of day for you. Like it's built into the HinksPix and built into most of the newer Culps and Falcon controllers. The HinksPix and most of them also can support audio output. On the Falcons, you have to get a separate audio add-in board that clips in on the side here. Most Culps have a built-in audio on the newer K32s and K16, or you can just use like a USB audio dongle on them. And then the HinksPix also has an audio output jack. So on the SD card, you would put the FSEQ data or some derivative of it and the audio data. The controller can support scheduling and playlists, kind of the basics of playback, and it'll just play your show off of the controller. What it's more advanced is, it's commonly referred to master remote or multi-sync mode. And this is a mode of operation that's very popular in FPP because it was kind of like the first types of controllers to do master remote. And you kind of want to think about master remote is a little bit like a conductor and a bunch of band members. Each controller will have its own sequence data locally on the controller, and the master player will just send out kind of time code syncs. So the master player will say, hey, everyone, let's play Baby Shark. And all the controllers will basically load up that sequence and they'll play it. And every second or twice a second, it sends out a packet to basically tell all the controllers, you should be at this part of the song. And the controllers will, fudge forward, fudge back a little bit to keep in time. It's a lot more efficient because instead of like in bridge mode where you're sending the data over the network, this is just sending the sync packet over the network. So if you want to do like a Wi-Fi show, this is a lot better. And if you have large shows, you do this as well. Most modern controllers now support this. Like Culp FPP, they're kind of like the original protocol was the spec of FPP in the old one days, so they support it rather well. Falcon V4 supports it, the Genius and the newer firmware support it, and even the ESP Pixel Stick V4 beta firmware also supports it. There is a pull request also on WLED, I believe, to support it. So it's kind of becoming more popular. It's a very more decentralized approach. And you can also use this too. A more advanced ways, you can actually have Pis be remotes and then bridge to other controllers. So if you have very large displays, and I'm talking like 200,000 plus pixel displays, you can kind of distribute the data and lower your network load. It does require that you have the sequence on every device, but with like FPP Connect, it kind of manages that all for you. The last slide stuff I want to talk about before we'll start showing this in xLIghts is a little bit about smart receivers. The whole idea with smart receivers is you'll have a master controller, and then I call it like daisy chaining of them. So you'll have a wire go to the first one, like it's a long range, so you can go like 300 feet. Then you can plug in a second one, and depending on what controller you have and type of smart receivers, you can basically plug in either 3, 6, or the Hansen supports 16 of them can be daisy chained into each other. So it's a way that you can kind of get more ports. They're not really more ports. What a lot of how the Hansen calls them, they call them data streams. So when you chain the receivers together, it actually puts all the data on the same port. So this diagram I got from Wired Watts. He has a website that explains this in a lot more detail. Is when you chain these controllers together, all the data on the first ports are kind of put together in the same stream or pool is what he called them. And then that is sent out over the network. So if your controller has a max of 800 pixels per port, which is like the standard if you're running 40 frames per second on a CULP, all of the port ones of your smart receivers basically have to be less than that 800 pixels, and all the port 2s added together have to be less. So you could do this chaining up to 6. The Hansen can do 16, but again, you still have to be under that 800 count. So 16, 800 divided by 16 is only 50 per port at that point. So when you do go, so one thing about smart receivers is if you put 3 in a line off of a controller, they all have to be smart. You can't have a smart and then a dumb at the end. This is allowed on Hansen. You can actually put one dumb on the end and basically fake out as the first smart receiver, but I don't think any other smart receivers support that. And you have to also make sure that they're the same protocol. So if you have some smart receivers that are V1 protocol, you have to then make your V2s basically be in V1 mode, and then you can only do 3 on your chain. And when you do these smart receivers, you do lessen your pixel count by a little bit. So the V2 protocol, some places say it's 25 pixels, some say it's 18, but you basically lose 25. So instead of being 760 or 800, it's 25 less than that. If you're using the V1 protocol, it actually uses a lot less. It's actually 30 per smart receiver. So if you only have 2, it's only 60, but if you use all 3, you lose 90 pixels. And that's kind of the advantage of V2 and why they got away from V1 is the amount of pixels you lose. So I try to make a diagram of, there's so many smart receivers out there, and there seems to be more by the day. So the thing when getting smart receivers is you kind of need to pair them with the controller you have. The V1 or these white ones, these work with the Falcon V3 stuff, which is the white boards. They only work with the Falcon V3 and with FPP. So they don't sell these anymore, so you're not going to really, the only time you'd ever see these if you're buying them used. But unless you have older gear, I would try to avoid using them. But they can also work in what people will call dumb mode, where it's just one, like your standard receiver. The V2 line of Falcon / FPP ones, there's multiple revisions, and different revisions have different support, which is a little confusing. But they normally look like the second one here, or they'll be blue. So black is the ones that are specifically for CULP. Blue are ones for the Falcon V4. If you have a V2 revision, which are like the first revision that came out in 2020, they only work with that type of controller. So if you have a V2, a black one, it only works with a CULP. And if you have a V2 blue, it only works with the F16 V4. I may be a little incorrect about that because they did fix the firmware at a certain revision. I think that's the 2.1. But if you're looking to buy old ones, my rule of thumb is just kind of match the color with the board if it's a V2. If you have a 2.01 revision, which will be down here, the firmware, these came out a little bit later. They have bigger microcontrollers that could support both of the firmwares. So 2.1, the blue and the black will work on each other. It's just the dial settings are a little bit different. And the 2.1 also supported the V3. There was a bug, I believe, in the 2.0 where the old white controllers didn't work. But I would just try to stay away if you're buying most of them now. So on his website, the Pixel controllers, he renamed them now to be the SR1 V4, and it looks to be about the same. The labels are a little bit different, but now the XRX1 also supports auto pixel selecting, I'm kind of calling it. So the older ones like the V2 and the V2.1, if you had a Culp or a V4, you had to put the dial in different positions depending on what type of controller you had. Now in the newer ones, it auto detects those types of protocols. So if you just put it on channel A for FPP V2 protocol and for the F16 V4's protocol, it'll just automatically work instead of having to. The older ones, if it was, you had to basically either do A for one type of controller or you had to do 4 through F to do the other one, kind of. So the newer ones just auto detect that, so they're a little bit less of a hassle. So you'll see them on his website. They're listed now as an SR1, and I think he has an SR2 for an 8-port. Similarly, the Genius controllers, they have the auto protocol detection as well. So if you put them on a Falcon or if you put them on a Culp, you just set it to A and it'll detect them. These ones you can chain 6. I forgot to mention that. You can only chain 3 on the older ones. But also if you use a Genius with a Genius controller, it supports auto inline position detection is kind of the term. And how it works is the controller sends a special packet. So if you plug in the first one into the second one into the third one, and you're using it with a Genius, the Genius will actually know that it's the first one plugged into the controller, then the second one and the third one, and you can just leave it in its auto mode and it'll automatically just assume ABC. If you do want to switch it up, like if you wanted the first one to be receiver C, you can change it manually, but the auto mode just kind of assumes that you always want the first, second, and third in line. It only works with the Genius stuff because there's a special protocol packet, so you do need a Genius for that. If you just use it with a Falcon or an FPP, you would have to manually set them as ABC. And then the Falcon V5, kind of the newest one out there, it supports all the features of the V2 ones, the auto detect, everything. But since it's using the E fuses that can measure current, it actually can measure current and it can turn ports off. And I know helping people in the xLIghts room, this has been a little confusing. If you use this with an older controller, if it doesn't receive data for I think it's 1 second, it actually turns the ports off. So if you're using it with older controllers and your lights just turn off or something, it has to basically get data from the V4 and the FPPs to know to turn on the lights. So it'll auto turn off the power to make sure you're not basically turning on pixels when you don't need to. So it all supports auto, and it works with basically all the controllers, different protocol selection, and then with the V5 and the new K16 V2, it supports the current measure where it can actually tell you how much current's being drawn on the port, and it'll go back to the controller. So smart receivers can be kind of confusing and complicated. I know in the Zoom room it's like a huge topic, so I'll try to give some information. I personally only use a couple on my show, so I'm not going to say I'm the expert on them. So I guess my tips for a successful season, if you're very new getting out, the most simple approach, like it's your first year, you're very confused by all of this, you're already lost. The most basic approach would be using Xschedule or FPP. Xschedule is the most easiest, but I believe FPP is a little bit better. You put your controller in what I was calling bridge mode. In xLIghts, just set it up as DDP for the kind of newer controllers. Use E131 for older controllers. That's the most basic approach, probably the easiest way for success. If you're doing this more advanced, have larger shows, then we can start introducing smart receivers. It's a little bit more complicated with how you configure them in xLIghts and the concepts of pools, data streams, whatever you want to call them. So those can be confusing, but once you get a hang of it, it's pretty easy. And then I would call the most advanced mode, and it's not actually that hard. I think receivers are almost more hard these days, but FPP master remote mode. And if you're using all culp controllers or you're using, this is relatively easy. I don't run culp controllers, but I run my own controller, which is similar FPP based. I do master remote, and you can also use it with your panels, virtual displays, things like that. And it makes everything a lot more simpler. Okay, so that's the end of death by PowerPoint. Oh no, sorry, I got more slides. Oops, sorry. So I kind of want to talk about how it works with xLIghts. I'll try to go through this quick and then we'll just show it in xLIghts. So xLIghts basically configures your controller automagically, as some people would say. If you see older videos, they talk about universes, start channels, configuring all that. That's kind of like the old way people used to do it. If you're still seeing videos about that, I would just not do it. Watch them. Just delete those videos. Newer ways now in xLIghts, and it supports most of the controllers and most configurations out there. You just let xLIghts configure all your start channels. xLIghts will automatically calculate everything for you. You enable auto configure auto size. When you move props around on the ports, it'll automatically move the channel layout for you. You just save and then you upload to the controller and you're done. xLIghts will upload all of your input, output, configurations, everything to the controller, do it for you. You don't even really have to think about it. Like a lot of my controllers, I don't even open the web pages. It just automatically works. And unless you have issues, you normally don't have to go in there and configure anything. So like I say, just auto all the things. I know some people don't like auto upload, but you can do that as well. And it normally works pretty flawlessly. So how we configure in xLIghts, the main way is the visualizer. You just take your models from the right list, you drag it onto your controller where you have them. If you have multiple props daisy chained, you just drag them over. If you have smart receivers, we'll show how to configure that. And then once you're done just auto configuring everything, you just upload. So it's relatively easy. xLIghts also has this discovery feature. If you already have your controllers set up, I would not use this, but it is a way where it sends out kind of a discovery packet on your network and it'll attempt to find controllers on your network. I'll show that in my demo here, but as you'll see, is I have a lot of controllers on my network, so it kind of sometimes gets garbagey. So if you're just having one controller on your network and relatively new, it probably will find it and it'll be easy to config. If you have lots of controllers that you meticulously set up, it may be just make a lot of garbage in your layout that you don't want. So xLIghts uploads to the controllers. I would say that not all integrations are the same. Most newer controllers, they have what I call an API. So xLIghts talks to your controller through an interface in the back end. A lot of newer controllers, they actually have an API or they have a backend written just for xLIghts or for software to talk to it. So in xLIghts, we use those APIs. It works and it makes the integration what I would consider better. So Falcon, FPP, Genius, they all have APIs. Same with WLAD, they have a config API. ESP Pixel Stick too has a JSON API. And then I worked with Joe from HinksPix, and he actually implemented one as well that I use in the HinksPix upload that I wrote. Older controllers like AlphaPix, SanDevice, they don't have what I would call this xLIghts integration. So what we have to do in xLIghts is basically simulate the button clicks on the website, which sometimes is not as great and sometimes won't work as well. Like SanDevice, for a long time, I used to just do a double upload because it wouldn't work well. And so if you have some of those controllers, these older ones, less capable, it should work in theory, but you may have to maybe try it a couple times or manually fix things. Okay, so that's the end of Death by PowerPoint. Okay, so I have a brand new, I guess maybe I should stop. Is any questions? Everyone lost? Anyone even hearing? Is this thing on? Or am I talking to myself? I guess, is there
If you have any
any?
questions, you can just unmute and ask.
Okay,
In the in the master remote mode, you mentioned several controllers that did work with that, but you didn't mention Hinks picks. Will that work in that master remote mode?
so HinksPix, they have their own master remote. So if you have all HinksPix controllers, they have their own multi-sync method. But no, you can't like sync an FPP with a HinksPix. You would have to just basically do bridge mode with them.
Okay, which was my next question is what if I have a mix of different brands of controllers?
Yeah, so in that kind of use case, you would have to have basically like xScheduler FPP send data to those controllers. Because yeah, you can, like if you have a virtual display or a matrix running FPP, you can't bridge that with their bridge mode. Or you can't have FPP master remote mode with HinksPix master remote. You would have to have an FPP device sending to that HinksPix. But you could, if you have like a virtual matrix running FPP and a Pi as your master, your Pi could send data to, some of your controllers, but then you could FPP master remote with the things that do support it. So you can mix and match if you have a relatively large network.
Okay, so if I have a Pi, I can mix and match the different controllers and run some bridge and some master remote.
Yeah, you can. And I didn't talk about it too much. I made a video about it. HinksPix does support sending data as well. So if you have a HinksPix controller in their playback mode, which if you have a large show, you can't really use too much, but you can, if you had like two HinksPix, they can actually do their sync with their playback. And they also support then sending 32 universes of data to another controller. It's kind of not a very common thing. HinksPix are not as popular, but you can, in theory, use a HinksPix with its playback mode and send some data to like a Falcon if you wanted to, or another controller. But once you start getting like FPP virtual matrices and stuff like that, 32 universes is not enough. So then it's better to go with like a Pi-based solution, in my opinion. So I want to show xLIghts a little bit because my baby, I guess. So in here we have the discover button. So when we do this, it'll send out kind of like a discover packet to your network and try to find controllers. You will get this pop-up if it finds kind of controllers with the same host name but different IPs, which right now I'm getting on one of my controllers. So I'll just hit no. And if you see, the reason it did that is I have this Genius that's coming up as two IPs right now. But when I did this discover, it found all of the controllers I currently have on my network. So I have some FPPs, some Experience, a Falcon. I think this is actually a WLED. Sometimes the discover doesn't actually set the type if it has a struggle finding it, but it should set the type and all the configuration for you. If not, like if you just want to do this manually, you would just add your controller over here. There's three types. USB would be like a local serial one. Most controllers we use, E131 style, it would be this add Ethernet button. So you click add Ethernet, it'll add a controller. And once we add it, we then have to fill out the information. So kind of want to start at the top and go down. You can give it a name. So if you want to say this is your main controller, you can put that. You can put a description. This isn't really used except for your readability. So if you want to say this is my house left controller or something, then you could remember. The things that are critical are the vendor, and this is needed for the upload. So we'll have vendor, model, and variant that'll pop up. So let's say I have an Experienced Lights. I have a Pro 16, and this one doesn't have a variant, but some of the other ones, if you're using a Falcon, you have to say if you have expansions on it and things like that. there's these three main boxes. So auto layout models, this is kind of the box. This is the auto magic for everything. If you don't have this enabled, you can't use the visualizer. xLIghts won't shift your models around and do the channel layout for you. You basically have to do old school universal start channeling. So by default, this is enabled. I would keep it enabled. There's also an option for auto size. This basically resizes how many channels are on that controller to fit the number of pixels you shove on there. So it'll make how much data you're sending controller increase and decrease depending on the pixels. If not, you can just set the size manually. Like if you want to send 200,000 channels to one controller, you can do that. But auto size just basically makes it as tight as possible, so we're limiting the amount of data. So I would keep that. Full xLIghts control. Most, like the Genius, Falcon, FPP, will have this option. What this means is when we upload to controller, it's going to basically wipe out everything that's on that controller and put the xLIghts configuration. If you don't have this checked, xLIghts will only change the data it cares about. So if you have this unchecked and you try to upload, it'll only, if you only, in xLIghts have it configured for pixel port 1, it'll only upload the config to pixel port 1. If there's stuff that you manually put in the controller on 2 or 3, it'll just leave it in there. And that can cause some issues. So the full xLIghts control basically just says, this guy wants everything that xLIghts is telling it, and we're going to wipe out what was there before. So you can uncheck that if you're kind of doing more advanced things where you want to manually configure some of it. There's a default port brightness, which most people prefer being at 30. We have an option for active. This is more useful if you're doing master remote mode. If you do xLIghts only, it'll basically make sure when you upload to FPP and your master controller, it won't be sending bridge data to the other controllers. So if you have culp controllers that you want to do FPP master remote on, you should probably set this to xLIghts only, because then when we upload to FPP, things like that, it'll be in the right mode. But if you want to be in bridge mode, I would just leave this in active, and that's what I'm going to be kind of demoing here. There's a monitor checkbox, which this is used in FPP to see if it should ping the controller. Some controllers, like the AlphaPix, don't like being pinged from different IP addresses. So if you have like an AlphaPix, I would uncheck that. Suppress duplicate frames, that basically says don't send duplicate data to it. It's kind of more advanced. I would just leave the default. So IP address, we need to put the IP address. Pretty sure the controller is 82. We can also set up a proxy, like if you want to bridge through a proxy. I'm not going to show that, it's kind of advanced. Then we have the protocol. So in xLIghts, there's kind of, the controllers can say their preferred protocol. So when I added this Genius, it actually switches to DDP, because when I wrote the upload and talking to the experienced guys, that's kind of their preferred way. You can get more pixels on DDP than E131 because of the channel efficiencies of DDP. So if you add an experience or an FPP, it should auto select DDP. You can do E131 if you want, but I would just keep it as the default. So there's some other stuff. The channel size, if we didn't have auto size, channels per packet is used in the low level stuff. Just leave it. Keep channel numbers. This is for the start addressing. If you're using a WLED or an ESP pixel stick, you need to uncheck this because they don't support absolute DDP addressing, but most everything else, Falcons, FPP, Genius, they do support it, so you can just keep it checked. If we didn't have auto size, then we could edit this. So
Scott, we have about 10 minutes.
okay, so yeah, there's a lot of settings there. Kind of the main ones are description, vendors, model, and then your IP and protocol. So once we do that, we can now, in theory, if we hit open, make sure I got my IP right, this will open the controller page. One thing with the Genius, it's not good to keep the page open while it's uploading because it sometimes screws with your config, but we can see the config in here. But once we upload, xLIghts will just kind of wipe that out. So in xLIghts here, we have the visualizer. This is where we would drag everything on. This is just a blank layout, so I don't really have anything at the moment. So let's just do a basic layout here. I just make a 16 strand tree. So there is also a way in xLIghts you can say the controller in here if you didn't want to use the visualizer. All the settings are also in here. But the more common approach that most people use. So I have a mega tree. I put it as, just to start with, 16 strings of 50. Let's just make a star, some random other stuff. It's not really intro to xLIghts class, but this is how you just click and drag, make models, import stuff as needed, make a real simple layout. And now we go to the visualizer. We just drag stuff where we want it. So I dragged a tree here, and it's using 16 ports. If you're like, well, I only want to use 4 ports, what do I do? You can change it in the layout to fix it. But I have added some right-click options. So there's one that's just called change string count. So let's say you only want to use 4 ports on your controller. You can do change string count. It'll redo the math to do the strings per strand and the pixel counts to keep them in the same perspective as what was in your layout and just kind of mash it up onto one for you. So with the visualizer, just drag all this stuff and you set how you want things. And that's about all there is to it. Once we have our layout, how we want it, we then just go down here. We hit upload outputs. That'll upload to the controller. And now if we open the controller, we go, and the tree as we uploaded is just on there. All the configuration from xLIghts. These are all the models. If we go, if I could do this right here. If you see, basically now the controller matches what we dragged and dropped. Arch 1, Arch 2, all that. So that's kind of the quick and dirty way you can do it in xLIghts. That's basically all I really wanted to show or talk about. I don't know if there's more questions. Yeah. Like I
If
said,
you have a question, you can just unmute and ask.
yeah, here's the QR code to this presentation again. So if you want to, get to it, I also have it on my website. If you go to that, presentations, pretty much every presentation I've ever done, I keep them embedded here on my website. So if you ever want to get to this, get all the data off of it, and any other ones I've ever done are also on here. So guess that's all I have.
Scott, there's a question in chat says, do you recommend sticking with one vendor for your controllers?
I guess that's kind of a personal opinion. A little bit. Like I personally at my house use all FPP based controllers. I think from like if you have all Falcons or all Geniuses, you'll probably have a better time. Because sometimes using smart remotes from Genius with a Falcon, they do work, but they're a little bit more configuration. Where if you're using Falcon controllers, Falcon receivers, it kind of has a more vertically integrated, a little bit easier to config. But yeah, if like a lot of people, I work on some commercial shows, it's all Falcon stuff. I work on other shows where it's all Culp stuff. There is some brand loyalty. It's kind of like, are you a Mac guy? Or, do you like all Apple devices? Do you like all Samsung devices? A little bit of brand loyalty at the end of the day. But most stuff will work with each other. The Hinkspick stuff, Holiday Coral stuff's a little bit rougher to work with because it doesn't support some of the other features like a master remote, but it still supports bridge mode, so you can use those with other brands relatively easily. There's one about the
Next.
F4 support Wi-Fi natively. So I think you're talking about the F16 V4 and the V5. They do support Wi-Fi for uploading configs and master remote mode is my understanding. They do not receive E131 mode and bridge mode over Wi-Fi, but they do support Wi-Fi for like master remote and uploading.
That was my question. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, I just had so basically what I'm doing is using my FPP to run my whole show, and so I'm looking to add 2 or 4 new moving heads this year, and so I'm looking to add a controller to run those moving heads to link into xLIghts, but I want to basically put it on my Wi-Fi network that I run my FPP on to send the information to the controllers. So I was just wondering if that's possible, like natively, or if I had to get a different adapter to connect to the controllers in order to get them on the Wi-Fi to talk to the FPP.
So you could do like master remote, but I don't know if that would be the best in kind of your scenario. So they do support Wi-Fi in here, if I remember correctly. I don't know. Network. But kind of in your instance, you're probably better just running it off of your Ethernet because it'd probably be better in bridge mode. I've personally never used master remote on Falcons. I know some people's mileage varies on how well it works. I've had some people say it doesn't work well, some say it works great.
Yeah.
So for Falcons, I would just use it in bridge mode, especially if you're just doing like DMX and a couple things with it. Like that's only relatively small amount of channels. So
Okay. Yeah, that's just I've just been trying to map out what all I need because I have no controllers now on my light show. It's completely on Wi-Fi with different kinds of controllers. So I don't have any like physical like culps or falcons, but I'm trying to add these moving heads this year. So
yeah, if you're
putting them
really
on proof.
like Culps are really good doing like master remote Wi-Fi stuff. Like you have to get the right dongle from them. And he does have I think a F4 that just has one DMX port on there where you could do that.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think, Scott, we're good. Thank you.
Mhm.
And thanks everybody for coming. Thank you again, Scott.